Alrighty, so I mean, we've just been having the most random of conversations to start an innovation discussion behind the scenes. But who would have known that concussion and rugby can bring people together so much, AD?
Incredible international sport bridge to innovation. Who knew?
Oh man, it's one of those things. Right, so my usual introduction is this is all part of book research. For anybody that's watching this live or recorded, if indeed you ever do that, we've done this because we want to be transparent. We want to make sure that we lead and bring you some really good insights from people that are from all around the world who know their innovation, who know their corporate strategy, who know about leadership within the real estate industry. And ultimately, sadly, you can't get all of the insights into a book. And something that Dean says might spark something off that will never make the book. So we want to make sure that you guys get the transparency of everything that is said. And, for all of the, sadly, you can't tell everything, but, in a live format, it does mean that we get some more broader insights for all of you. So I hope it helps. Dean, you've been on my radar for years and years and years. We sort of shared the same sort of spaces, just on different continents. Please just sort of introduce yourself and the variety of different roles that you've had over the time, and perhaps why you think that I would want to interview you for this book about the digital transformation of the real estate industry.
Sure, happy to do so. So Dean Hopkins, I'm currently an operating partner at a New York private equity firm called Greenpoint. But I'll take you through a little bit of my background because I'm a relatively new addition to the real estate spectrum, having spent the first 30 of my years in the working world on the tech side of the house. Actually, I started my career at McKinsey & Company in Toronto. Really got a good grounding and how to think about big, hairy strategic problems. And then in 1994, that's way back in time, I became an entrepreneur and started a firm which over 10 years became a 500-person, $50 million turnover firm with about $1 billion market cap. Survived through the downturn in 2000 and sort of it's still around today, but I left it in 2005. And so that was a very much an innovation journey to help people embrace this new thing called the internet and the web. So I've been in the internet universe and the innovation universe pretty much since then. In 2005, I handed the keys to my right-hand guy and let him run it. And then I joined Thomson Reuters, not directly, but as an advisor to one of the senior C-level people to help that journey, which was basically to take 350 companies that they had bought, including Reuters in 2007, and consolidate them into a global operating company instead of a portfolio of a lot of little companies. And that transformation journey was fascinating. We'll talk a little bit about it more in the later conversation. But I really got to go from entrepreneur to a 65,000 person, $13 billion company and see how that group handles innovation, handles sort of a massive transformation journey, and learned and applied a lot of the entrepreneurial stuff into that setting, which was interesting. And then after 12 years of that longest running project in history, I decided to sort of switch gears. I touched down a little bit in Toronto at a place called 111, which brought me back in contact with entrepreneurs, scale-ups, but very quickly transitioned and was recruited to be the chief operating officer of Oxford Properties, which is a global $80 billion integrated real estate firm that operates in 19 countries and has assets in all the food groups. And so I not being a real estate guy, that was a big, what am I doing joining real estate? It was really to help that company realize its digital ambitions, really to say, hey, listen, we can be one of the leaders. The CEO was a big believer in applying digital capabilities to the real estate spectrum, but he needed somebody on the leadership team that wasn't from the real estate world. So they dropped this alien form of Dean into that seat, and I spent the better part of 3 years building the strategy, building the team, building the capabilities, and getting that organization pointed towards what I think is a pretty exciting future. And then after 3 years, my mission was done and the team was set up and ready to roll. And I left but fell in love with real estate. And so I decided that the right thing to do was look around and find a company that was now building what I consider digital real estate companies from the ground up, which has led me to Greenpoint. And we'll talk about that in more detail. So now I'm in the business of investing in real estate and helping build the next generation of digital real estate companies from their inception.
So it sounds, I mean, it's funny enough, we almost come from, we come from very different worlds, but with a similar sort of idea of falling in love with real estate. Just a little bit about me. When I was 22, 21, 22, I was meant to work for the John Lewis Partnership, which is a obviously big brand
Yeah.
in the UK, on their graduate trainee scheme, straight out from university. And I didn't really have any idea what I wanted to do whatsoever. I fell into it, and it was quite hard to get into. And it was the day before I was meant to start work. No, 2 days before I was going to start work there. I was being shown around some properties in London, and I found my calling. I just went, this is really cool. I mean, the properties are amazing, and
Yeah.
that was obviously the resi sector. But I then spent 4 years working for a broker in London, probably one of the most aggressive and forward-thinking in the UK. Actually, no, they were at the time very much the most forward-thinking, and I just fell in love with the asset.
Yeah.
I didn't expect to. I didn't want to. And then I spent, the last 20 years doing it. So I totally understand that falling in love with something. But I want to go into one thing, and you put it in your LinkedIn bio about, and I'm quoting here, you are a thought leader on the digitization of commercial real estate. How do you think the real estate industry is going with that big, lofty sort of goal of digitization? How are they getting on in your view?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a very consciously architected set of words, because I think it's job security for a very long time, because there's a long way to go. But I think, first of all, what's really interesting, as I got to know the real estate industry, it is not one thing. And I think a lot of people get that wrong in terms of it's this, one big hairball. And it actually isn't. I mean, everything from, large scale capital allocator LPs who are just looking for the right investment, to investment managers and who are, literally deploying capital, to asset managers who have assets and they're trying to value maximize, to property managers who have the very, very hard and thankless job of actually delivering the product of real estate, and everything in between, all the service providers. It's a very complicated industry. And I would say each part of that industry is moving at different speeds. They have very different needs. They have very different, call it, capabilities for change. So if you take the property management side, the people that actually deliver the product of real estate, buildings also are not all created equal. So an office complex or a very complicated enclosed mall is very different than a logistics shed, or a multifamily dwelling. And so you've got to actually really, the devil is in the details in this question.
Yeah.
I actually think the folks that are probably the furthest along in their journey are the people the furthest away from the physical real estate. So the investment managers, the folks investing and even asset managing, they are deploying more technology, more data, more analytics to sort of drive their thinking. They have some limitations in terms of what they can do, but they don't have the, let's call it the albatross around their neck that is the sort of legacy tech and kit that exists inside the buildings that a lot of the property managers have to deal with. So there's a long way to go. The closer you get to real estate, the harder the actual digital journey becomes.
I think that's a fascinating observation, which I haven't heard anybody talk about yet. And I'm just going to sort of quote you back on it. You said that the folks that are probably furthest along in the journey are those that are furthest away from the physical real estate itself.
Yes.
Just give me some understanding as to why you think that is the case.
Sure. So if you think about the asset class from an investment point of view, that is real estate. So real estate is not unlike investing in fixed income or stocks and bonds or currency, in that it is a financial instrument that you can buy and sell. Now, it actually is the largest asset class in the world. If you sum all the other asset classes up in the world, all the stock exchanges and all the fixed income and all the currency, real estate's still bigger than all of that. But if you start to look at how those people buy and sell the asset, basically the asset itself, the physical building, is but a number, right? It's a spreadsheet. It's a underwriting model. It's an Argus model evaluation that has a bunch of assumptions that go into it. But it's essentially a digital artifact, right? It's a series of numbers that lay out on a spreadsheet that determine whether you buy or sell it given the market conditions. So it actually trades very similarly, although less liquidly, than a stock, right? So the investment managers, the people who are allocating capital, what they're looking at are numbers. They're looking at data. They're looking at how is this asset class performing? Do I want to sell? Do I want to put more capital in it? Do I want to put less capital into it? So effectively, they're not in the real estate business. All they're doing is investing and looking at the investability of those assets, right? So the further you are away, the more natively digital it becomes, because you're really just manipulating numbers on a spreadsheet and really trying to understand from a house view point of view, how is the market performing and how are my assets performing relative to the market? And should I buy or sell? Should I take more risk? Should I take less risk? So that's the allocators and investors. Like they're really, let's call it, quite distant from the act of delivering real estate.
Okay, so I mean, I find that a really interesting thesis, and I can see the way that you're working through it. So going back onto that original question when I asked about your tagline of being a thought leader on the digitization of the commercial real estate industry.
Yep.
I find it interesting when I talk about a lot of the research I've done in the book is around digital transformation frameworks and what that really means. And the thing I keep coming back to, and I hear it so often because so many people confuse the notion of what digital transformation is and what it is not.
Yes.
You're talking about digitization. A lot of people talk about digitalization, and then there's a digital transformation journey. And people I don't think, realize the differences between the three elements of that. And I think what you're talking about with the asset managers and the people who you say are removed from the market is that they are starting to get to grips with what I would say is phase one, which is digitization. But would you say that they've now started to be able to create new markets off of the digitization element of it? So they're moving into that sort of the digitalization aspect, making new markets, making new profits, making new business units from the digitized element.
No, they're not there yet. They still. So I like the framework. I like the notion of, you've got to be somewhere from a digitization standpoint before you can start to productize that into digital outputs. I haven't seen many great examples of, let's call it digitalization. There are a few. So, in the US, there's a very large kind of multifamily operator who has actually built an incredibly robust for themselves kind of capability for operating and managing their properties. And it's so digital, it's so end-to-end, it's so frictionless that now there's a demand coming to them just to buy that capability. Not the arms and legs in it, but the actual software and services platform that kind of allows them to deliver better economics and better service into the multifamily space. And I view that as sort of
what does it look like? Just give me.
So think about it. It's basically, if you think about the buildings themselves, they are a collection of service providers that wrap around the building to deliver the output. So it's the gardeners, it's the janitorial people, it's the person that comes in and washes the windows. Like there's a million of those little kind of service providers, and then the consumer who's using the product or the property manager or the facilities manager says, I got a need, help come and fix it. So connecting all those dots, making sure the right people get paid, making sure the right people are dispatched and scheduled and managed. That's actually a very complicated and somewhat, poorly managed thing in the real estate space. And this one group has actually really modernized that so that it's super efficient. It's incredibly digital native. So the whole thing happens digitally, including enrolling and unenrolling new service providers, making sure those service providers get connected to the right property, making sure that all the right things are happening at the property, the billing's occurring, yada, 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 all the way. So basically the act of that is entirely digital, which means that they can launch a new facility and just light it up like that instead of having to go and procure all these services and do it poorly.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because from what you're describing, it really shows that the digitalization element has happened because people are interested in the capabilities to make that happen and not necessarily in the multifamily asset that they hold.
That's right.
So they are becoming more tech than they are prop.
Well, at least in this one leg of it. And they actually have an investment vehicle by which they're investing in a more of a venture style way in these kinds of assets. So it's starting to, for me, look a little bit like digitalization, right? Because they've got a pool of capital that's a risk-oriented pool of capital that has a very different risk profile than the asset class itself. They've created this capability and they've separated it from the operations of the real estate, because they've said, okay, well, in order for us to build a software business that actually does this properly, it's got to be its own thing. And then they brought external capital into it, so they're managing it as a, let's call it a challenger business, is one of the things we used to call them, which is, a business that's not inside, call it the inside the organization itself, because it will die inside the organization. It needs to be separate, and I'm sure there's other examples of that I'll think of as we talk. But those are the kinds of conditions that have to exist. If you're going to digitalize, you have to realize that you have an immune system inside your organization, and that immune system will kill innovation if you don't structure it arm's length and allow it to do the things that it needs to do. And I've found that actually real estate has an immensely powerful immune system. Like, the immune system is woven structurally into the way the real estate world works, which makes innovation so challenging. It makes digital transformation so challenging because you have to overcome that inertia.
It does, and I mean, when you talk about the challenger brands, which is a good way of looking at it, it speaks of what innovation theory talks as the ambidextrous organization, to be able for leaders to look at both what's in the fore and what's in the future. Yep. People know I get on my hobby horse about all of this, but the best, I think one of the best, most obvious examples of that is JLL.
Yep.
When they had JLL and then they created JLL Tech, and obviously
yep.
after that they had JLL Spark. And it's interesting because you get different perspectives from within JLL as to just how successful it's been. But I do think that it's been upset because of all the challenges that COVID brought and everything else, which meant that even though it was structured as a classic, not necessarily a challenger because it wasn't challenging the mothership, but it was Christian Ulrich, who set it all up, was very focused on, we need to create its own cost center. It needs to be very independent, except for the very top tier. So, there are a few people doing interesting things, but
they won't all work, but that's the right idea. Like, they're on the right track. And other things may disrupt the disruptors, but I think that those conditions, especially if you want to digitalize, like, I think you can digitize inside your existing organization if you have the right courage, leadership, the right skill sets. But to digitalize, you've got to separate.
I've not seen many of that. I saw one example in Hong Kong last month when there was a big developer, 10,000 odd employees. They put in, and one of the Hong Kong is very family orientated in terms of the way that the businesses are structured, and it's very legacy family owned businesses. And this was a hotel developer which had then diversified into other assets, and they had done it as good as I'd seen anybody do it, in the sense that they employed somebody who was very much their chief innovation officer, who actually I'm interviewing in a few weeks' time because I was so blown away by the attitude they had. But that's probably one of the very few examples of where companies have not done it using a challenger, but actually done it internally. And
the digitization or the digitalization? Like, I think,
I think
the digitalization, no argument. Like, you have to do that outside. Digitization itself can be done inside. That's what I was saying. But I agree with you. There are still not many examples of organizations on the first horizon that are digitizing that have actually seen all the way through the bumps in the road and have had the courage to stay the course. I'll talk a little bit about why I think that is, but all of my peers, like people that kind of were in the similar jobs to me, because I built a network. One of the first things I did being a new person to real estate is I said, I need to find my people. So I went out across the industry and I just sort of found all the people who were weirdos like me, who were starting to ask these questions and drive these agendas. But the person at, Crown Estate, literally everybody who was in my seat, all by happenstance, somewhere in 22, all are no longer in those jobs. So there was almost a clearing of the slate of all the people who were driving on the large institutional side the degree of change. For whatever reason, a number of different conditions created it, but it was almost like the whole industry paused and maybe even took a step back on the journey kind of in 22.
So, going off on a tangent here completely, that's what I'm seeing now happening again. There's a second round of that.
Yep.
I've seen one very, very considerably large European investment manager has had their entire innovation team cleaned out.
Yep.
Another global one has just had their entire transformation team cleaned out.
Yep.
And I find that
it's the immune system at work, James. It's the immune system at work. And I'll tell you, there's a couple of factors to it. One is there's never a good time in real estate because you're either in a bit of a boom or a bit of a bust cycle, right? So the boom cycle, which I was working in, I had a bit of a boom and bust happen at the same time. We were in an unprecedentedly high transaction environment. Like, I think we did north of 10, 12, $15 billion worth of transactions a year for all 3 years I was at Oxford, which means everybody's very busy, right? It means there's no bandwidth to entertain change, right? To sort of say, I gotta put my pencil down on this deal, which I have to do, which is how we move the needle on returns, and actually spend time thinking about changing what I do. So boom creates no bandwidth for change. Bust when there's a lot of...
Well, hang on. Is it bandwidth or need?
Because,
again,
both.
When there's massive occupancy, if you're massively occupied, why bother?
Both. Well, you're hitting on my number one thing that people do wrong in change, regardless of whether it's digital transformation or any form of change, is they don't do the first step right. The first step is unfreezing. And unfreezing is getting people to admit there's a problem in the first place. So if you don't start by saying, we've got to change, and you make the case for change, and everybody shakes their head, regardless of knowing what the solution is like, they go, we cannot continue on the current path with what we have. If you don't get people to actually do that step first, you can't start showing them solutions, because you're going to be showing them solutions. They're going to go, I have no idea why I would even need that. And that...
Yeah, but that leads on to my massive bugbear in the sector, which is, whether we call it success inertia, which is what I always refer to it as, because we're doing okay, we don't need to do anything. The one thing that you need is visionary leadership in order to know that this isn't, this is cyclical, it's going to come back round, and what do I need to do as a leader to create some form of future proof on this?
Yes.
And I don't think we are willing to test our life support machine, to carry on your analogy in there. I think we're quite happy to, sort of put our trust in the sense of it's going to work, and we're not looking for any other future innovations around.
I had that though. Like the guy who hired me, Michael Turner, he had spent a year or 15 months before I even joined, maybe even 18 months I even joined, building a sense that there was a really good opportunity to even distance ourselves further from the competition, right? By embracing a digital way of thinking. He called it 4.0. And he was out evangelizing it at every turn, getting the whole organization excited about it, getting people to realize that, yes, there was a real opportunity here to move forward. A lot of young people.
But why did he think that, Dean? What was it that was the trigger for him to look at 4.0, to tell you you're coming on board to help the digital ambition of the company? What was it that he saw that others haven't? He
spent a lot of time immersed in the innovation community because he was very curious, very super curious guy, reads everything, spent a lot of time with entrepreneurs, kind of knew the guys who built Procore and VTS, and immersed himself in those communities. And the light bulb just went off. He said, we can't continue doing the things the same old way. There's an opportunity here. The next generation of people are going to demand this, right? So if we want to attract and retain the best people, we can't keep doing things the old way. It's just not happening. He also just realized that when he started looking at other industries that went asset light and went digital, and then onward into new businesses, he saw that was something that real estate could do. And he looked around and no one was doing it. So he said, listen, I think we can do that. And then he also had a big growth ambition, which is we needed to grow from 80 to 100 billion of assets. And he thought, could we do that without having to add a lot of people? Like, can we keep great people, but can we use technology to absorb the growth? And so he saw a number of factors, and he sort of talked about those. And he thought it would be very exciting for people to see not only a successful business, but a successful business that was also challenging itself in terms of providing new capabilities. And by the way, Oxford has long been an innovator. Like some of the in the 90s, they were doing things that we still today consider quite innovative on all fronts. So this is a natural part of the history of Oxford, and so I was the big, a big part of that solution. He said, "Listen, I've told you a lot about this. Now I'm going to go outside the organization and bring someone in who actually thinks differently to us, who's going to challenge us, who's going to help us execute what we want to do."
So I'm finding this fascinating because it speaks to a conversation I had actually earlier on this morning, my time. I was interviewing Gareth Lewis, who is he runs the emerging trends report for PwC.
Yep.
So he actually, that's part of his job. The other part is a lot in the finance and the M&A world within real estate. We talked a lot about curiosity, and it's that word that keeps coming back. But
yes.
The other word that you've used that he also used was complexity. So he talked about curiosity within leadership as being absolutely paramount, and that is well known. But I'd almost forgotten about that as it's one of the most important skills that our leaders need to have, and I just don't think they do have it.
I agree.
And the complexity element he was talking about as well, that you mentioned about the complexity of the industry and the asset class, and he was talking about the fact that one of the biggest challenges he sees the industry has is that we are going into an even more complex industry with mixed assets, and
yep.
We've been quite happy with having an asset, and you walk along the street and what you've got. Whereas we're moving into a period where leaders have got to address the fact that we are moving into a multi-asset environment where you're not going to have any clear definition.
There's other forms of complexity and ambiguity that are starting to emerge, right? Well, the notion of time. So where we had time before, because things moved at a relatively, what seemed to humans be a relatively comfortable clip, we're on a much more accelerating clip in terms of the pace at which new things, new ways of doing things, new economics, new cycles are compressing. So the ability to move at pace is becoming not a standstill. You have to accelerate. And real estate has only started to realize that the people who actually kind of can stay at the pace of innovation are moving away from them faster than they can catch up themselves. So there's almost like this, if you're a laggard, the ability to go from being a laggard to catching up to the leaders is getting further and further away as people who embrace things like, if you get your data environment together, like there's a bunch of plumbing, like non-interesting stuff you have to do. But if you get that right, then you can move up to leveraging advanced analytics and then leveraging AI, which then the more use cases, the more iterations you have, the more the moat you have and the further you're accelerating away from your peers. And if you don't even spend the time to do the basics, which I don't even consider innovation anymore, they're sort of table stakes, you are now, from a time perspective, way further behind than by just standing still than you ever were in the history in the past, because things are moving so rapidly.
Which reminds me of I used this, a long time ago when I was doing more keynote speaking. There's a Hemingway quote, which I think was in one of his books in 1929, when he said, and it was a quote from one character to another, and the one character just went, "Man, how did your company go bankrupt?" And the guy went, "Well, it happened really, really slowly, but then really, really quickly." Yes. And it was the Will-I Coyote is a sort of the up-to-date version of that, where he sort of they run off the cliff and you're sort of standing there paddling like that, and you're doing okay, and then suddenly straight down. Yeah. So it speaks to all of that. Listen, we've gone very deep, very quick in this. I think we've got a mutual passion for this sort of area. But I want to go back a step in terms of your journey, because I find it fascinating. You're one of the very few people that I'm aware of who have almost sort of touched every different element of both the industry, but also the mentality that you need to survive within what I see as the future of the sector that we're going into. But I want to start on the different industries that you've been in first, and the approach that they've all taken to innovation. Because obviously you spent a considerable amount of time working on a very, very prolonged project with Thomson Reuters, and then obviously you went into the sort of the accelerator sort of space, and then moved into Oxford. How have you found the approach to innovation in all these different industries that you've been a part of?
Yeah, so I think and
I should quantify. Are we just typical, or are we entirely separate to everybody else in the speed at which we're approaching?
Well, listen, I think the speed to which we're approaching it, we are orders of magnitude behind the leadership in terms of organizations and sectors that are good at innovation, right?
So hang on, just qualify that for me. Are you saying we're just behind in time, so we're one of the last asset classes to
No,
move to digital transformation? Or are you saying
our cycle time is too slow? So the innovation happens in iterations. It doesn't happen. You don't wake up one day and have this huge insight and then you immediately move from where you are to that huge insight. It's actually it's a cumulative set of lots of different iterations. At least that's been my experience. And there's no substitute for learning. You can't jump from where you are to, 2 or 3 stages ahead. You actually have to go through the process of the learning. And so the longer it takes for each cycle of learning, the slower you are to get to to catch up to people. So for example, if it takes you 1 year, every time, you do a strategic plan, you iterate once. Anybody who's doing it quarterly or monthly is just going to be moving that much faster than you because they're able to make the learning, process the learning, ingest the learning, and apply the learning rapidly. And if you think about software, we used to wait for the .0 releases would come every couple of years, maybe even every 3 years. Now, think about how often your iPhone updates. It updates every day, right? Because there's new code releases every day. That's an example. That's a 365 or 700 and some odd day cycle time improvement on software because it used to be every 3 years. Now it's every day. That's innovation at work because now you can start to try things out. If it doesn't work, back it out, add something new. And I think everything I've done, so when I was at Cyberplex building a kind of a web agency, no one even knew what the web was. So the first couple of iterations were just helping people understand what it is. And then we realized we had to build stuff. And then we realized we had to support and maintain stuff. It's just like iteration upon iteration, we were moving very, very quickly. When you get into real estate and you realize the cycles in real estate are much longer because the business cycle itself is sort of 7 to 10 years for leases and the development projects take 5 to 7 years. People are just more used to a cadence of business, which is much slower. And as a result, the cadence of change is very uncomfortable when you try to move at a pace that's very different than the cadence of the business itself. And that's why I see there's a big difference is just on one dimension. The iterations are just not happening. They're not happening fast enough. And as a result, you have to stay in the courage state much longer. And it's not easy to do when the business climate changes.
So we talked about being brave this morning and that leadership has to be brave and probably more brave than ever in the changes that they're going to have to make. So using your quote about the cadence of real estate cycles is slow. And it doesn't matter, by the way, whether you're in retail, commercial, industrial, residential, it's all the same because everything seems to be getting a little bit shorter. We live in our homes for a little bit of a shorter time. We lease offices for a much shorter time. So the deal cycles are getting quicker. And arguably, I have a theory in my head that actually over the next 20 to 30 to 50 years, actually, in particular, the changes that are happening in the commercial world are actually going to roll into the residential sector. And I think the Generation Z coming through are going to be much more transient.
Yep.
The idea and the concept of what home ownership actually is very different to you and I compared to a 15-year-old now. They have no hope necessarily of owning their own home as we did. So actually the concept of home and work is all transient. So I think deal cycles are speeding up, but it doesn't help the notion of trial and error, change, and all of this. So my question to you with all of that behind is perhaps an obvious one, which is how, given what you've done in leadership positions with Oxford beforehand, how as a leader in real estate can you be brave when you've got such uncertainty and probably more worryingly, more ambiguity in the sector? How are you able to manage the changes when you can't do enough of the change quick enough?
So I think my counsel to a lot of organizations that I've worked with, both Oxford and outside.
It's a lot of counsel, a lot of shoulders
to
cry on.
I'm like the bartender who sits behind the bar and just sort of cleans glasses while people come and talk to me, or on a couch. Like, there's a lot of therapy involved in this. But
that's what we should do. We should do a conference, right? And it's just a bar, and we just create the Cheers bar where we just counsel people.
There's a ton of that, but it's basically just start. Like, don't overthink it. Like, don't spend all of
start what, Dean?
Pick a question. Doesn't matter. Like, there's so much. The field is wide open. Just start. So I'll give you an example. One of the leaders at Oxford, who was a former investment banker, former analyst at a hedge fund, who'd seen in other asset classes quant models, predictive models for driving investment thesis. He was very brave, and he said, "You know what? I'm going to give you a question." And so what I actually think is missing in real estate are the big questions, not the big implementations. So he had a question. He said, "Listen, we got this sector called kind of large molecule life sciences, which is sort of this variant of life sciences that no one's really spending time doing in it." He had this thesis. And he said, "Do you think we could build a quant model that explains why one market like Boston is growing faster than, say, Philadelphia? And can we study that with data? And can you help me identify markets in the US where we could invest capital because they're going to become great life sciences markets? And we're going to see them because we're going to see some signal before other people do." That was the question, right? That's the exam question. And I said, "That's fantastic. Let me take that away and see if I can help you find a way to do that." And we did. We built an unbelievable framework for studying supply-demand dynamics using proprietary cuts of data that no one had done. And subsequently, we then used that to focus the investment teams who went out and deployed a very multiple billions of dollars of capital ahead of everybody else because he asked the exam question. And so where does bravery come from? Bravery comes from people who are not so worried about the implementation. They're just, they have a really profound question. And they've partnered up with people who can figure out how to find the answers to the question. And if you do that, what happens is if you get enough of those questions and they start to have the impact, you iterate through them very quickly and you start to get on the road of digitization.
I have great admiration for one of the academics in this area, Josh Pankin at Columbia. And he almost shouts from the rooftops that the industry does not ask enough big questions. That is his literal saying. I have 1,000. I even remember this is how much I remember him talking about it. I even remember exactly where I was on a phone call with him in my local town, about 10 miles that way. I had a loaf of bread. This is random. A loaf of bread in my hand, and he was shouting down the phone at me about the fact that while he was at Columbia, nobody was asking the big questions from real estate. Which meant he had all the resource. He had all the people that you're saying need to be able to answer the questions. Sorry, answer them, but no one was asking.
So this is it. This is the thing. Like, if you had to boil it all down, why does digital transformation not happen in real estate? It's not because teams aren't assembled to answer the questions, because they are. It's no one is asking the questions. So, this was something I learned very quickly in Oxford. I built this amazing team, all these muscles, recruited data scientists, rebuilt the whole way in which we deliver applications, built cybersecurity teams. I realized I had to ask the questions because I wasn't getting the questions from the people in the seats who were driving the bus. And so I then started finding the people who had questions, and I started prompting them, getting them to ask them. And then that changed.
Okay, so let me put this to you about that experience. And it was Michael, I think. Is it Michael
Turner?
At Oxford. So he brought you in because he said it was because you were not from industry.
Yep.
So were you able to ask those questions because you weren't, you didn't have the noose around your neck from all of the experience of real estate beforehand. So you were able to ask these big questions because, what's the right way of phrasing it? It's not that you didn't want to feel you just had the ability to do it.
I wasn't encumbered by history, right? So part of it was that. But I don't view I was asking the questions. I think I was asking some of the questions to get the ball started. right? Because I was looking at things that they would never have looked at. So one of my big bugbears in this whole thing was that when we looked at the assets themselves, they weren't properly cyber protected, right? So we were starting to get lots of data being emitted, lots of things being added to buildings, but there was very poor cybersecurity at the foundation of real estate, and so I couldn't sleep at night knowing that was not happening. And so everything I wanted to build on required that we add more digital capabilities to buildings, but you could only do that if the underlying kit was secure, and it wasn't. And I can prove it in the entire industry. One of the biggest untold stories is how poorly cyber secure the built world is. And I've got horror stories to show it. But I realized that I could ask a couple of questions that I had some domain in. But what I wanted to do is more show the leaders of the organization it's okay to ask those questions. And that's when my colleague came forward and said, what about this investment thesis I have? Which then his peers started saying, well, if he can ask that question, I can ask other questions. And it became infectious to start asking those questions because we made it okay. I just got the pump primed because I started asking some questions that were from a domain that I was comfortable with.
Do you think this was an element of, and I'm going to harp on a little bit about change management now, and maybe you were creating, that buzzword of creating psychological safety. Yep. Were you creating an environment which made it okay to be curious, to pick up that word that we've used beforehand? And as a consequence, was that part of the way you brought the team along with the changes that you needed to make at Oxford and Thomson? I'm sure it had the same or a similar thing, right?
Same formula, same everything. Even back to my day starting my own company, I was going into my clients and getting them to realize that there were some questions they could ask, like what do I do with this thing? Like how do I think about it? How's it going to have an impact on my customers? Like creating the dialogue in a way that was safe and exciting and interesting and got the blood going. I've done that all the way through my career at every single job I've had. I've always been the guy who sort of said, hey, listen, let's just stand back from this. It's sort of like working on the business versus working in the business. When you're in the business, you're in the machine, right? Don't ask any questions. Just sort of keep the widgets moving from left to right. When you work on the business, you stand back from the whole thing and you start asking questions, and asking interesting questions. What ifs? Like I think the biggest two words that the whole organization, the whole world could learn from in real estate is just put what if in front of things. Like, what if we did it this way? What if we thought about this? What if we built a quantitative model that predicted, how markets are going to perform? And if you add what if into things, and you do it in a way that's sort of disconnected from the day-to-day grind of things, it's amazing how quickly people respond to that.
But playing devil's advocate a little bit, you were able to do this because you had the authority, yes. You had the flexibility to do it because what Michael had instigated was a culture of curiosity, of exploration, of yes. challenge that made you question everything. Yes. What would be your advice to organizations that don't have any of that?
Well, an important thing on my role, you'll notice that my role at Oxford was not called Chief Innovation Officer. I have a profound dislike for isolating innovation into a role. I just think it's a terrible idea. Back in the 90s, there used to be this thing called the Chief Knowledge Officer, which basically meant, well, the only person who had knowledge in the whole organization was this Chief Knowledge Officer. So everyone just stopped collecting knowledge. I think the same thing is true about innovation. Innovation isn't a job. Innovation is what everybody does every day, all day long, to think about the next question. How do I move the ball forward? So I insisted that my job was not about innovation. I was the Chief Operations Officer. And the idea was I was designing the operations the way we wanted them to be at our target state. And so it was, how do I build that from a point of view of it's not innovation, it's just what we are going to grow up to be, period. And so what do you ask me, what advice do I give to people who don't have that role? Well, you have people around the organization who own processes, who own, delivery of outputs. Challenge them to make a start. Give everybody in 2024 part of their objectives for the year is they've got to find one big question and move the needle on it over the course of the year. Period. Everybody. Like, make it everybody's job. The CFO, the head of property, head of investments, head of asset management. Like, there's nothing stopping them from asking the question. Once you have the question, then they can, figure out how to, because we're very good at it, figure out how to go and respond to the answer. Or they'll realize as they try to come up with an answer, the gaps in their capabilities that they have to answer that question in the first place.
Your point about innovation is very, very poignant. It was a recommendation we did back when I was with Unisu. We did a large global report about the digital transformation of the industry, and we were asking who's in charge of innovation in the company. And I remember, I think we had 68 responses that in the end we thought, they're good enough that we'll analyze. And I think we had 67 different job roles.
Yep.
And one of the recommendations from the report, I think it was recommendation 4, was don't have innovation in your job title.
Agreed.
And it was because of exactly what you've said, which is if you say I am the innovation manager, then all innovation just gets sent rather than creating it across the organization.
And it actually doesn't work, because what happens is the people who make the decisions about allocating the resources, like, I need this team to focus some of its time on changing the way we do a process or implementing a new system. Those people don't report to the head of innovation, right? They report into the line managers. They report into the staff teams. And you actually need, transformation is a people thing, not a technology thing, right? It's actually about winning the hearts and minds. It's about getting people to realize they can change and get comfortable through the pain of the change, that on the other side, the juice is going to be worth the squeeze. So it's a human thing. They have to change the way they want to change and do something differently, even if it threatens their job. So
if you went back into a large business like an Oxford again, and you were charged with a change management project, and you've already said that you'd encourage people to ask questions and do the what if and all this sort of stuff, but that's probably not going to be enough. So how would you structure a new challenge around changing an organization's processes and practices? What would you do now based on what you've learned at Thompson and at
Oxford? A friend of mine at Oxford, he was the best at this. He said, "Show me how people are paid and I'll show you how they behave. Period. End of story." So if you want to drive change, you have to make it hurt their compensation if they don't change. So you have to say to people, you know what? 50% of your compensation is finding and delivering a step change in the way you do things. And you can instrument it however you want. And you don't have to figure out how it's done. You just have to compensate them for making the change and then let the magic happen. Because I believe that people are smart, they're driven, they're capable, they're adults, and you don't need to overmanage them. What you need to do is you need to create the conditions for them to feel the freedom to go and to pursue it. And if you say, I'm going to change the way you're compensated, and this matters to us so much that I'm going to put, it all on black here, and you're going to go, I want to see what you do with this. You're going to be amazingly surprised at the results. You will unleash a lot of change.
Yeah, and I agree. And I was celebrating it because you're the first person who has really talked about the challenge of misaligned incentives in the real estate industry. We have a huge problem.
Yes.
When you instigate some form of future forward-looking, innovative outlook, and the innovation team or whoever it is who's in charge of the project have got completely misaligned incentives with the core aspect of the work.
Yep.
It won't work accordingly. So I have to put my non-biased perspective, because I agree with you, and challenge a notion of that, which is the bit which I still struggle with, which is it's okay saying that and saying we're going to re-incentivize how everything works. And I am 99.9% sure that is going to create real uncertainty within not all employees, because I'm sure some of them will weigh up the fact that, oh, hang on a minute, this industry, this business, this leader is changing things, and okay, I'm comfortable with that. Not everyone will. That's the first challenging one to make.
Good.
The second challenge.
Good. Yes, please.
The second challenge then is probably a deeper rooted challenge for the leader, which is that of the stakeholders that are involved, but the shareholders.
Yep.
Especially if you're in a public listed business, that sort of shake-up is incredibly risky for them as leaders to do that. And how would you then
I think it's incredibly risky for them not to do it. Like
I agree.
Standing still is not an option, right? It is not.
But that's your attitude, and that's my attitude as leaders looking forward and having the ability to be slightly ambidextrous and being able to look forward and now. But I would say a large majority would not believe you.
Then we'll just let it play out, because and this is the way industries shake themselves out, right? There's people who are on the front foot, who are the challengers, who are the pioneers, who set out to kind of reframe the game. There are, some become skeletons on the side of the change journey, but some, usually the second one through, ends up becoming quite very much a leader, and they redefine the economics of the industry. And then a bunch of people who, they just realize too late and they can't get there, and then the world gobbles them up and transforms them because they can't stay a laggard forever. I think in this industry, it's going to happen. I think the return cycle that we're starting to see, like we're in the headwinds portion, down part of the cycle. This is when the real leaders will emerge in the next 5 years. We're going to really see those who kind of take the time right now to redefine the economics of the industry and use data and interesting ways to reform their portfolios. I think you're going to see in 5 years' time a real differentiation between haves and have-nots, and the performance will definitely spread between those. And so, at some point, you can only just argue leadership for so long, and then you let results speak for themselves. And then you say, okay, which one of these do you want to be? Do you want to be, that kind of return, or do you want to be this kind of return?
Okay, so I can only bring in two more questions. I do have to go and collect a very discombobulated 13-year-old who whacked his knee, or whacked someone else's knee with his head today. So I'm going to have to cut this far shorter than I would like to. So I've got two questions. One is a very personal one around your journey next from the transitioning now into a sort of a fund environment and the PE world, which is very different. But the first one, it does come back to that leadership point about you saying the real leader is going to come out in the next 5 years. So I suppose my statement or question, I don't know how it's going to come out, but do you feel that the current leaders are still going to be the leaders in 5 years' time, or is there going to be a usurping movement of new leaders coming in with slightly different perspectives, which will win out in the end? Where do you think we're going to go? So I suppose the actual question is, are leaders today fit for purpose for the market that we need to have in 5 years?
I mean, it's hard to paint the whole industry with a brush. I think there's a few people I'm watching very carefully that I think have the right ingredients. They're sponsoring the right kinds of things to happen. They're moving at the right pace, that I think will have the feet under them and the right momentum, that I think will be very much the leaders in 5 years. But when I look around,
what sort of characteristics have they got?
They've made some bets that I think are the right bets in terms of capabilities, people, leadership, projects, outcomes, that I think are showing that it is possible, and they've done it at some scale, right? And I like what I'm seeing as a result of that. I know some people that have really swung for the fences maybe a little too early. They're now learning from that, but I think they're learning in a way that others who haven't swung for the fences won't have. And my sense is over time, they're going to really be players. There's like 3 or 4 of them in the world that I really like. And the rest, I think, are classic. They're very conservative, sort of people that are weathering the storm and not taking the advantage of this time in the market to really, when things are quiet on the investment front, yes, capital and returns are a bit struggling, but now's the time. If ever you're going to do it, now's the time to sort of differentiate yourself. I think there's 3 or 4 people in the world doing it. I'm watching them very carefully. And then also there's is someone going to come in from the side? Like, is there a challenger coming from a corner that we haven't thought of that I think will, and remember, right off the top of the call, I said, this industry is not one thing, right? This industry has lots of different component parts. And I think the challenges are going to come to different parts of this industry and really reframe it in very interesting ways. I think it could happen at the property management side first, because that's been a really tough industry that will be relatively easy to shake up. I think the investment management and the sort of capital allocation side, it's going to do what it's going to do. But I do think that the property and the stuff close to the assets is going to get challenged from some corner that we're not yet aware of where it's going to come from.
And going back to where we started, then, is that because closest to the asset is the least digitized at this point, in your view?
Yes, and
hence why it's easier to be digitized.
Least digitized, had the dustiest, oldest, crappiest technology around it, is low margin. So hasn't been a lot of incentive from the existing players to actually have enough resource to do anything about it. The small experiments that have been done on relatively small scale have demonstrated pretty good results, and they just haven't scaled up yet. And it's a global phenomenon. So what I think is likely going to happen is you're going to see innovation come from kind of globally. It's going to maybe rise up in a market that we're not really paying attention to, and it could run like wildfire across the rest of the world. So I think there's,
interestingly, there's a slightly different angle on the tech play there, because I've always been very conscious of visiting markets which are very new from a technological standpoint. So I've always come from the tech bit rather than the prop bit, and when I've either done speeches or emceeing at conferences, I've always deliberately gone to emerging markets. So for me, South America is very exciting. Africa is very exciting, because in my very, very simplistic notion, they have tremendous real estate markets, but actually very little tech adoption.
Yes.
So the whole concept there, and this isn't on the real estate play, this is just purely on a tech play, they have the great ability to be a massively fast follower of taking different models from elsewhere and applying it to a local market with the legislative, financial, and societal implications, and actually scale very, very quickly.
Yeah. Well, Singapore is a fantastic example of that, right? I mean, they've really got some very, very interesting societally digital capabilities that the built world is starting to lean on. That's generating very interesting data sets and very different learnings. And so I watch Singapore very carefully, because I think it's super, super interesting about what they're doing. But yeah, I mean,
weirdly, so I haven't heard anything. So Indonesia and Taiwan are two very similar in that region, where when I said I was in Hong Kong, I met the Taiwan PropTech Association. I was thinking, there must be about 4 members. They've got like 60 companies registered in Taiwan alone.
Yeah.
In Indonesia, there's a population of, in fact, not dissimilar to the US. So they've got markets which nobody even knows about, because they're sizable.
Vietnam, you want to see innovation, you want to see creativity. Vietnam, South Korea, like these places, mostly because we don't see the English translation of things. They're living in 2050 as far as we're concerned. Even Nigeria is starting to do some very interesting things. There's a lot of innovators in Africa, and we sort of think about African as the poor continent. Not true. Just not categorically not true. So
I've had the pleasure of being in Lagos twice, and it has struck me both times how far ahead they are. And I mean, perhaps almost ironically, on a fintech sort of prop tech symbiosis, there's very much a good crossover there. Anyway, I could go down a rabbit hole. Just tell me about the sort of the fund world.
Sure.
You've moved now into the with Greenpoint. How have you found that transition? And is there a particular focus for you that sort of speaks to all of the stuff that you've learned?
So Greenpoint is an interesting firm. Chris Green used to run real estate for Macquarie globally. So he came from a very large institutional background, ran $80 billion in real estate for Macquarie, and realized, like me and like all the people he's accumulated into the team, there's a better way to do this. And so he's created, let's call it an alternative manager, whose focus is on finding real estate sectors that have really good, let's call it tailwinds, but that have subsectors that are poorly understood and that could be disrupted with technology, and literally where there are fragmented assets that are, call it, run by unsophisticated operators. And if you can assemble those assets and add a tech-enabled operator over the top of it, you can release and unlock a lot of value. And so it really, the headline for Greenpoint is operating, investing at the intersection between real property, sustainability, and technology, because we're trying to bring those three things together. And we have strategies in the UK, the US, and Australia. We own 150,000 acres of natural capital regenerative farming in Australia. We own a bunch of van electrification properties in the UK, where basically, because Amazon needs to, and like-minded companies need to electrify their vans in the UK by 2030, there's no place to park and electrify those. So we're building out the infrastructure to do that intersection of, again, sustainability, technology, and real estate. And then we have a number of strategies in the US, one of which is truck parking in the US is a massive problem. It's poorly understood, cousin to the industrial real estate. Electrification's coming. And so we're building a very large network of called the national operator of truck parking in the US, where we own the real estate and the operator, and have built a digital operator from the ground up, using technology to essentially double the yield out of an individual piece of real estate. So I'm an operating partner there, which means I get to do two things. I get to work with the operating companies to affect their strategy, and I get to help Greenpoint itself become digitally native from the ground up. So a real estate private equity firm that is itself digitally native. And that was a unique opportunity that I just didn't see anywhere else.
It's like heaven.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
You literally get to walk the walk as much as anything else.
100%. We almost have $1 billion of capital under management, and it's only a couple years old. So, we think very bright light on this, and so far the reaction from the big global LPs has been predictable, which is, wow, you guys are doing things that are very different. We've been using data strategies to drive all of our acquisition activity. So we have literally every plot of land in the US at a plot level. We have metadata about that plot and can map its attractiveness into our various strategies using advanced analytics algorithms. And so then we can focus our investment teams down to which of these plots is appropriate for truck parking and why would it be more attractive as truck parking. And then we can send our acquisition teams in there rather than waiting for a brokerage to bring us ideas. We're turning it around and being super proactive about assembling this global network using data. We're using the same for electrification and on and on. So we're like eating what we dish out, and using it to success.
To be fair, for the LPs, that's exactly what they want to hear, because it gives them a massive tick in the box as well for being forward thinking as well, which is you're doing what you're saying, which is
correct.
Especially in a market, I think, which is going to get more constricted over time. And that's an entirely different discussion around the venture and PE world, which is, I think, going to struggle over the next couple of years. So we'll see where we get to. But anyway, Dean, I am going to have to dash. So I'm going to end the live stream, but publicly, I just wanted to say thanks so much. Don't disappear just yet. I'm just going to end this stream, but really fascinating insights on all of that. So really appreciate it.